more of the roles in the departments. They want the things that nobody wants to do. And they take those roles not only professionally, but also in their family life. And consequently, for example, we have a huge disparity between women and man pay gap in the UK. The University of Sussex did a wonderful thing last year, my alma mater of my PhD. They gave a £4,000 raise automatically on all women professors. And that was a brilliant thing to try to close that gap, but it's not sufficient because that gap will open. So these things about this issue about of academic citizenship has to be seen not only in relation to the outside world, but also to the inside community, to our own body. On a personal level, of course, I face those dilemmas. We just finished a pre-conference here, and it was a very difficult pre-conference because we decided to join our network and do the pre-conference in combination with practitioners. And those practitioners represent these precise sectors that we tend to criticize in our work. And I had this colleague I'm originally from Maracaibo, which is 6 hours from here, and I wanted to invite one of my colleagues from Venezuela to come here and participate, and he said he declined. He said, if I go there, the government is going to say that I'm receiving funding from abroad, and I'm going to be, marked, and he has been marked already in the past because of this. And he couldn't. We heard about people going to ICA who decided, not to go to ICA this year in San Diego because of their positions around the ban trial. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it will always come down to an individual choice, to an individual decision of how we go to there. I came here by land. I have spent 2 weeks in Venezuela helping organize the plebiscite over there of the opposition. That was a very difficult choice because I, for many years, have been engaged and identified myself with the most progressive ideas that I could think of, and the opposition in Venezuela is not of my taste at all, and I have profound disagreement with many of the sectors representing the opposition. But my view was, and that was my decision, and as I say, it was a really hard decision, that I am for democracy, and that for me at this moment, at this conjuncture, at this crossing point, it was very important to take a position, which I took, and it cost me dearly. It cost me friends, it cost me families, members who no longer talk to me. It cost me that huge sectors of the academic life in my own country now are not in speaking terms with me, and it cost me a lot, but that was my decision. And I understand other academics, other colleagues who take a different position in Venezuela and other parts on this, and we have had serious discussions about this. And I think that's another point that I want to remark, that not only it comes to an individual choice, but, and more important, that choice needs to be made. You need to make those choices. There's not in between. Academics are well known for remaining on the fence, for remaining on the edge. And our work seems sometimes for many that is not relevant because you're not giving me an answer. And people say, so what's going to happen? Well, and I think sometimes it's a very valid position to remain on the fence because actually the evidence that you use in your own work it's not conclusive, but in others and in many, the decision has to be made to make those choices. So I think those ethical dilemmas can be approached on an individual basis, and those individuals have to make those choices. And I think the first choice, and the way I made that choice, I cannot speak in the name of any of other of my colleagues, but and the way I make those choices is that and this is something that we have in Spanish, that we have a clear distinction between ethics and moral, although one is Greek and the other Latin and supposed to be the same, but we do make a clear distinction. And in Spanish, for us, you can be ethical and at the same time immoral. Or you can be very moral, but do something unethical. Let me put the example. And this was reflected in Hannah Hardet's Eichmann in Jerusalem. When she follows the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, she sees that the fact that when he's asked by the tribunal, by the prosecutor, he's asked, are you going to defend yourself, saying the same thing that your colleagues in Nuremberg said, that you were just following orders? And he answers, no. I was following the law. And he was right, because Adolf Hitler's word was the law. He was being ethical. He was doing what many academics in the UK do nowadays, which is they pass attendance, and the University in Britain send that attendance to the Home Office so they can check which individuals are not attending class so they can deport those individuals. That is happening in the UK at the moment. So those academics are being ethical, but they're doing a very immoral thing. I cannot show you how many memorandums I have in my about not passing attendance for the same reason, and many of us have boycotted that attendance just to set a case, a very small case. So it comes down to those individual decisions, and I think that they're not easy in modern times. I think this whole thing of impact and engagement with industry is an orchestrated manner to depoliticize the whole of the university sector. I think it's being done deliberately to compromise academic integrity. I think we have individual choice. I think the collective, and that's why I started talking about union, and the need to join the union, because that's a way of helping individuals make those choices in more comfortable terms, feeling protected by a larger body that can represent their individual choice. If they decide not to make that choice, well, that's their decision, but at least they would have this collective support to do. At the end, it's the only way to make that choice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jairo. Thank you for bringing us back. When I began, for those of you again who were late, when I began, I was talking about the lack of recognition in being an academic citizen. Looks like the debate has moved to how to avoid punishment instead of just getting recognition. I want to give a bit of time for my panelists to respond to each other, maybe a minute or so before we open up to the floor. But let me sum up some of the big picture ideas that have emerged. I was thinking of a much narrower scope, and I'm glad my colleagues have broadened the discussion. My idea was really the issue that the work that we do is not sufficiently recognized and rewarded, as I mentioned. But I guess the debate has moved on to a larger issue of us as public intellectuals doing work that is not just not rewarded or recognized, but possibly even being punished, okay, even though it's actually the right thing to do. Right? So it's a larger debate. We're talking about engaging with society. We are members of the ICA, and I guess IAMCR as well. One key difference is that the IAMCR is very much politically aware. As you all would know, we are having the first major conference of the IAMCR in Oregon, USA next year. There's been, I guess, one joint conference, but it's sort of a small conference with my doctoral supervisor, Joseph Strauber, in Austin. But it's kind of a small one and not like your annual conference. So the IAMCR is much more politically aware. Interestingly, just this past conference in San Diego, someone came up to me later on from Denmark and said that she had heard it was at a conference that she's heard the most amount of political statements at the ICA conference ever. And the ICA tries to avoid discussion of politics, actually. It seems like it goes out of its way to avoid it. So in a way, it's much less politically aware. But what I'm hearing is that the environment has changed, and so you do need to look at this issue of politics. in the broad sense, not in the narrow sense of just governance, but really in a very broad sense of culture and of an environment. And then our role is to defend facts and truth. And I also like what Barbie had said about letting go of the academic default setting, where it's really the word used against us, of course, is your ivory tower, right? And we have to let go of that default academic setting. I'm going to give a bit of time for you guys to respond to each other and thoughts, a minute or so, and then I'll open up to the floor.
Can we put the lights up so we can see everything?
Can we have the lights up? Yeah, so we see the audience.
I'd actually like more to hear what those of you who are here have to say, but I do want to say just very briefly that it strikes me that we all gave the same talk, which it's interesting. I mean, it's perhaps predictable, but I think it really raises the very fundamental question of when sitting on the fence, when did it become so attractive, right? When did we begin to divorce, in Jairo's words, understanding from the need for change or the passion that accompanies that understanding? And it strikes me that the fact that we could all sit here and give basically the same talk it strikes an even more urgent chord about why things haven't changed up until this point.
Thank you. I apologize for being late and missing your presentation, Barbie. I want to ask a question about the vacuum that's created because academics are not more publicly present, and who fills that? Is the torrent of unauthoritative opinion our fault? Because we don't claim that territory, we don't make that space, we don't stake a claim for those spaces of opinion and the authority of knowledge that we should have, and therefore it creates a vacuum that's filled, and then we can't get in there because we're far too slow to respond. So I'd just like to hear what you think about that.
If I might, I actually talked about that. I talked about the pacing and the fact that the university pushes us to pre-schedule, to predict, to pre-orient, and so we're completely left at the side when things happen out of our control. I guess I want to throw the question back to you, however, because I wonder if our authority is the problem. I wonder if our insisting that we should have that voice, right? We should be acceded to at some level, isn't part of where we got to today. I mean, there was a session early on, I can't remember who it was, who said, in my classroom, I'm not offering answers, I'm just helping people raise questions. And yes, that's a lovely pedagogic phrase, but it's true, right? And so I do wonder if our assumption of ourselves, it needs rethinking. And so, many of the things that we've all been talking about in terms of, alternate modes of engagement and in terms of, really, creating a more activist presence is a way of tackling the fact that the old mode of authority doesn't work anymore. So when we talk about a vacuum, should a vacuum be filled with us? I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that.
We're not hearing you.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we know more than other people, but where we do have evidence and data and information, and we see a dispute that's between people who are both wrong, isn't it our responsibility to actually intervene and say, look, here's some facts?
It is our responsibility, but I think we have to figure out ways to intervene that people can hear us. I don't think that we've been intervening in ways that anybody cares.
Silvio, do you have a quick point you want to make?
I think that, the underlying issue here is a disconnect between sort of academic life and sort of non-academic life, and the reasons for that are multiple, as we all said. They are like question of incentives, rewards in academic life, but also the ways that many of us typically engage are not necessarily probably the best way that we should engage outside of the world. But it's clear that right now is different from the time, at least in some part of the world, in which basically, academics were deemed either as sort of too pointy-headed or being part of the technocracy or being part of the dominant power, the dominant elite. The situation is not quite the same. And again, it varies from country to country. So I think there are multiple reasons why that disconnect happens. And I think that what I gather from my colleagues here are several insights into where are those points that we need to affect in order to move things and strategies to do that. That just by doing media appearances ain't gonna happen, because it's much bigger than that. It's much more problematic than that, what the true meaning of public intellectual actually means.
Yeah, let me make a quick point on this. It depends really on kind of your area of work. So, pardon me for saying it's kind of an obvious statement. I'm involved with a group that's a pure Facebook group that's trying to defeat the burning of the ground in Indonesia. And literally 10 years ago, a bunch of us got together, and I had suggested a boycott of the companies. There's literally no traction. And then in 2015, of course, they got very bad. I think this pollution is literally global. You could see it, right? And this time, I could use the work that I had done on self-regulation and so forth to show how, because that's my work on internet law and policy, I could show, I was quite convinced that the boycott could work based on the principles in self-regulation, sort of name and shame and that sort of thing. And so, basically I said that the theory shows it can work, and we should try it. So the group of us, we did it again, and this time we got much better traction. The products of that company in question were pulled off of supermarket shelves. That really got global publicity. We got CNN, BBC covered it, and so forth. So the company has lost millions in sales, not just in Singapore, but in the region. And so it's been able to get some traction. Not so much of me as a public intellectual, but kind of based on my work to lend support to say that if you guys do this, the theory says it can work. But I'm coming from a point of theory that, hey, this can work. And I've done some stuff that would be considered pretty crazy, like it's possible to self-regulate used car dealers. It's possible. We need a separate discussion on that, but it's possible. So some crazy stuff like that to say that theory tells you some crazy things, but try it anyway. And so it's still on, that boycott of the company is still on, yeah. So it kind of depends on the context, I would say, yeah. Yeah, other questions, sure, please, yeah. Just identify yourself briefly, and then your question.
I'm Des Friedman from Goldsmiths. Thank you very much for great papers and a very expansive view of what we do. And it is genuinely disappointing there aren't more people here, because if we were having this discussion and following through the consequences, it would only enhance the critical work that is being done, presumably, in all the other sessions. So we should keep trying to do this. But I had a question about academic bubbles, which a couple of you referenced, and ivory towers, because I'm not sure that's an appropriate way of describing the conditions for the vast majority of academics. I think that's a kind of, well, it's hardly a romantic vision, but maybe it's just an old vision. Because for most people, they haven't got the luxury of being in the ivory tower. Many ivory towers have been demolished. It's a much more practical question of the kind of academic labor that we do. So you've made references to the precarity, the horror that people have to, younger people have to go through in order just to enter what they might think years ago would have been an ivory tower. For those of us who are within, the sorts of changes, again, that Jairo's alluding to around managerialism, around certainly in the UK, the obsession with metrics and quantification of everything that we do, which has really distorted the kind of intellectual work we can do. So there are those practical questions around how our lives have been transformed and how we should resist. But for me, the major issue in all of this is it's often in response to the idea that academics have for too long been detached and in an ivory tower, is that we should engage. And I think, again, Jairo and others have made reference to this. This, for me, is a very problematic assumption, because it quite clearly depends on what you are engaging with and who. For many years, Barbie started by saying that you can't insulate universities from the wider environment. So for the last 1,000 years, universities have played highly political and ideological roles by intervening. In a way, the ivory tower was always a myth. They have been absolutely crucial dominant players. And now in the UK, we are actually told, we are evaluated on the basis of our engagement. But it depends what you're doing. I mean, it was thanks to academics we got into the economic mess we did, leading up to 2008 because of particular models that were developed in economic schools, most of which reject any kind of alternative to neoliberalism. There are people I know in British higher education who have, and again, I was thrilled to hear Silvio's use of the word collusion, because that's accurate. They have colluded with government agencies to design systems of punishment for welfare claimants. Now, they may have justifications for this. So my question is, we don't want to oppose. I mean, to what extent is the ivory tower model either true or desirable? To what extent should we be talking about the opposite of engagement? Because I have Barbie, I forgot how many A's you have, if it was 3 or 4, but I have another A, which is Edward Said's concept of affiliation. And I think that's absolutely crucial, which is we place ourselves in solidarity, in sympathy with movements outside the university in order to realize, and for our research and work to contribute to progressive aims. And I think that affiliation to particular desirable progressive aims cuts against the kind of blanket endorsement of engagement, which I think can absolutely lead to collusion.
Okay, thank you. Jairo, you want to comment? Yeah.
I think you make a really good point on the idea that the ivory tower, that the bubble has been there. I try to emphasize the fact that it's always down to the individuals. And the reason is we can't obviate the fact that it comes down to power and ideology. And academics are individuals, flawed individuals, which is the point I tried to make by citing Oppenheimer and Roosevelt and Karl Marx. We are flawed individuals, and there will be individuals not only who will collude with power because it brings benefits to them, and let's not forget that the whole body of people who are denying climate change at the moment, they're all scientists. They're nuclear scientists, they're physics scientists, and who were the same academics who colluded with the tobacco industry to perpetuate the myth that tobacco did not cause cancer, So we forget that during the Cold War, academics colluded with the CIA to penetrate the cultural spheres in Latin America. So, we are individuals, flawed individuals, and that's the reality. But I think that in opposition to that, the way to make sure that that bubble or the ivory tower exists is that we have a very strong ethics, a body of ethics, that makes sure that if it can't constrain those individuals, at least it denounce them openly. And I think one of the problems that we have in academics is that we're too timid sometimes to point out when those things happen. And I think that's, if you look at certain academics, and by the way, it varies from country to country, from society to society. You might disagree with, for example, Podemos in Spain, which, but they have been all of them are academics intervening in society. And that's an example of intervention. It might be wrong, right, whatever. I mean, personally, I have serious disagreements with them, but they have been intervening in that. But I think we need to, in the academia, reflect and be more willing to point out when people are colluding, to denounce those things. It is wrong, period. It is wrong that any academic accept money from the government to design systems to punish the welfare recipients. We're going to have those academic things. It was academics in the UK who designed the English citizenship test, So, they are colluding, but we need as a collective body to denounce those things. So at least these people think it twice before they take the money. I think I don't think necessarily all of them are bad individuals, although I know a couple who are very nasty. but I think they also feel pushed to get money, to get recognition, to get promotion. And I'm going to go back to Hannah Hardet and the Each Man in Jerusalem, which I think is very valid for this discussion. I think her main finding on that book was, and which she wrote as a journalist, not as a philosopher, was that idea of the benevolence of evil. The fact that what she found out is that Adolf Eichmann was not this monster who didn't even believe really in Nazism. He would, the banality of evil. The banality, thanks, of evil. He was just a pencil pusher, a bureaucrat trying to advance his career. And I think the main challenge for academics is that process of bureaucratization, of allowing that process of takeover our important role of being this vanguard of society.
Des, thank you for your comments. I think you put it very clearly, all these sort of challenges, multi-layer ways of thinking about the engagement between academia and society. So my only observation is, because I mentioned the word bubble, has to do with this. I think there are two attitudes in academia that are not conducive to this kind of public engagement. One is the myth of the ivory tower, that you said, the refusal to recognize that everything that we do is political, even though it's not, an individual doesn't deliberately understand it as political work. It's always political, no matter what. So that is, and that varies across academic cultures and traditions. In some ways, I think the differences between ICA, the IAMCR that Peng referred to, in some ways, because they tap in different traditions of thinking about engagement, right? So one is the refusal to recognize this. And the second one is, how to put it carefully, is the assumption that academic politics is the way that politics in public life happens. And then we are like shocked, surprised, when actually society goes in places that are completely different the way that academic politics are. So the one I remember now is Todd Gidlin's famous observation that the left won the English department and Ronald Reagan won the White House. So how do we are aware permanently of this potential constant divide between what we discuss politically, our engagement in academia, where academic politics is in different settings, countries, and where the countries are. I'm not just going to minify sort of public opinion or anything like that, but where society is on this. And I think Barbie put it very clearly. If you're not aware of this, we're going to sort of continue to circulate in a world that is sort of relevant, that mirrors our own convictions, rather than being reminded to what extent our ideas travel or do not travel outside of academic quarters. That, to me, is something that, regardless of the precarization of academic labor and everything else, we have to be aware of. Otherwise, it's very easy to live in our own bubble in a comfortable manner.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what Silvio and Jairo just said, because I agree with everything they said, but I do want to say, I want to ask you, Des, what would be the opposite of engagement, right? And it strikes me that, I mean, I see your statement coming from a context in which the idea of engagement has been co-opted, right? You know, totally. And so I don't know that that makes engagement necessarily negative. I will say, however, that your point about the ivory tower never having been there, I agree. However, it is the myth of the ivory tower that motivates the institution. And so even insofar as in British academe, you've got all this kind of, talk about, the TEF and, creating better modes of servicing the public, et cetera, taking away the way in which a British intellectual in a university setting might personally think through that commitment. I think that the basic tension between the inner workings of the institution that is responsible for your job and for keeping you there, and pulls from that myth versus the outside world that we are supposed to be engaged with or affiliated with or servicing or looking towards, and them not having very much of a say at all. So there's a kind of fiction, I think, that is built in to what engagement looks like that I think you're responding to, but I'm troubled that we would only think of affiliation, because I think affiliation works when the cause, the entity being affiliated with already has its own identity. But we should be engaging or affiliating or orienting to people that don't have those kinds of already preformed identifications.
Would you want to respond to that? Kind of talking about what engagement is? Yeah, sorry, yeah. Oh, okay, sorry.
I think an alternative to engagement is cooperation, because engagement is when two separate entities connect. Cooperation is a completely different concept. Where I live in Australia, in Adelaide, there's a disadvantaged area where people have put signs up on their front doors saying, no researchers. And, like, no door knockers. We don't want any more researchers coming around to tell us, to ask us how disadvantaged we are, basically. But I don't know of any projects specifically where we go into those communities and ask them what they want and how we can help them. And so we have a push model of knowledge where we produce it and then we try to push it out. And the engagement metaphor is that we then need to somehow lock into the public and connect that our vessel of knowledge to them, rather than finding out where the gaps, not in the literature are, but in communities, so that we can do actual relevant work. And I think the other, another thing that often gets overlooked, and I say this as someone who came late to academia, is that industry, business, government, as soon as you step out of that and become an academic, any experience that you have had is trivialized. That you are not accepted as an equal to continue to speak about the 20, 25 years of experience that you had because of the ivory tower myth. It's almost like you've become, I don't know, diseased or something. So I don't like the term engagement. I prefer to think of that we need to be developing cooperative models of communication.
Okay, thank you for that. There's one final question at the back, yeah. And then we'll wrap up after that, yeah. So keep your question brief, please, yeah.
Thank you.
Your name and then...
Divina Fraumegs. I'm a professor at the Sorbonne in France, a member of IAMCR, not ICA, for exactly the reason you mentioned early. We should say that IAMCR is engaged and openly so. And it's true that the current, I was fascinated by this conversation because I think it's a conversation we're all having, not only at the university but around the bar, trying to understand what we are engaged in, with how our job has changed compared to what we thought was traditional authority. If traditional authority is the ivory tower, what is it now? Definitely broken glass, this ivory tower, because the social web has impacted it. And what we are, I think, trying to negotiate at the moment is the tension between the system before, the ivory tower, if you want, which was sort of a vertical, and the new viral internet context that reorganizes the circuitry, not so much of knowledge and truth as of trust. I think this is where probably I've missed some of the conversation you had. I think a lot of people are abandoning us along the line because they don't trust us. And this is where we have a lot of repair work to do. But that's why it's true that this industry, and I agree with two speakers from the floor, it has become an industry engagement. I mean, you have to engage on social networks, you have to produce, you're compelled to cooperate almost and all that. So it's true that it's hard to find a different word from the word engagement, though I still like it very much because I think it creates a lot of empathy. So I think in terms of research, what it translates in is in some kind of research that we tend to consider as marginal and not recognize, and that maybe in this whole displacement of university that we are seeing should be more center stage, which is intervention research. Just acknowledge the fact that we are intervening. And intervention research is now constant, iterative, agile, therefore embraces some of the approaches of the internet and the digital society in which we are in. I think we have to move into this and embrace it as an opportunity for us. Right now we're sort of mesmerized and waiting for the light of the car to strike us. We have to embrace the opportunities that exist and discard critically all the rest. But the capacity to intervene and do it transparently, do it often, do it in an agile method, recognize error, modify, try again. This kind of thing will reestablish trust, in my opinion. So that's, and I'm trying to think in a positive way before I commit suicide intellectually, because it is a very harrowing question, especially in France at the moment. There's a good example that we should look at, and I don't know if you mentioned it. To me, it is the creation of a conversation, talking about something created in Australia. Are you aware of it it's a creation, you know, where a journalist, the conversation, yeah, a journalist amends the proposal of a text by a scientist and makes it available. And so it's a combination of our research speeded up, not waiting for a 2-year term in a ranking paper, and yet some of it accessing the public rapidly in a way that is made for that public, and in a trustworthy way, because there's this sort of, bringing together of these, and open to comments, so playing on what the digital is good at. And this is not the only example. I mean, for instance, I think we should all put whatever we do on Wikipedia, damn it. Why leave it, wait for long, etc.? Just hack the Wikipedia, be extremely accessible, and let a lot of controversy, a lot of debate take place. We are too much guarded in that. And so I would move towards strategies of this kind that allow us to intervene. And I don't know what you think about that.
Okay.
Just want to be provocative.
All right, thank you, Divina. We're coming to the end of the time, so I'm going to give each of the speakers 30 seconds, sorry folks, to give a soundbite and then the close up. Okay. So you want to begin, Silvio? And then we come up, yeah. No? Okay.
30 seconds. I'm going to play advocate of the devil. I think slow is good. I think we're too worried about the impact is not going to come from the fact that we can intervene on time and very quickly. I think impact is our interventions important comes from the fact of what we actually say. And sometimes in this very fast world where everybody's rushing to say things, I think academics have the role to give reflection, and that sometimes takes time. So there's a lot to say about being slow.
Thank you, Jairo, for giving me my 30-second statement. I think slow and fast. I think that we're all talking about retaining some semblance of what we thought we were doing when we got into this, and yet figuring out how to connect, engage, affiliate, cooperate. I'd like an A word, but I can't find one other than affiliate, so I'm struggling here. But I do believe that we have to figure out how to be more diverse in everything we do and everything we value.
My sense will be that not lose of the whole thing about agency and structure. I mean, there are multiple individual choices with some level of restriction or limitation depending on the country and the university that you're working on. But let's not sort of focus on just the question of individual choices because we might forget the question of what are the structural trends that actually limit this sort of discourage the kind of engagement that I think we discuss here. So in my mind, sort of more attention is needed, as we typically say, to understand how, not what are the institutional constraints, but how they can be changed in ways that we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I began this panel thinking really, really narrowly, and it's very embarrassing for me to have to confess that. It's very narrow. I was looking at, like I said, a recognition for the work that we are doing for free, right? You know, example, reviewing, organizing seminars, and so forth. I did not tell my panelists what to speak on, and I gave them a very broad title, and they've kind of taken off and run with it, and I'm really glad for it. It tells me that academic citizenship is much broader. I cannot have one sort of definitive conclusion, for better or for worse. But quite clearly, it is essential for the academy. I mentioned that at the very start. But I think the speaker, questioner, somebody here raised a point that actually the discussion here would enhance the impact of all the research that is done out there. And that's how critical academic citizenship is. Thank you all for all your thoughts. I'm going to take it. I'm going to see what I can do with it. I'm not sure there's a conclusion to it. Some things I can do, for example, I have the idea of talking to institutions, dropping a letter to say that you should recognize a service and recognize some of these things that we're doing for free. But I think the larger debate of us as public intellectuals will continue as a public debate and public conversation. So thank you all for being here. Thank you.